All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for September 12th, 2022. Looks like we've got a fairly full agenda. Thank you for organizing everything. And Shane, it looks like you're changing things as we go. Appreciate that as well. Yeah, let's kick it off. Nick, I think you're first in line about the Contributor Summit CFP.
Yeah, just wanted to make, I know Rob and I, you've talked about it, I've talked about it, but we do have a opportunity to run a session at the Contributor Summit. I think it's probably worth talking about if we have two sessions or one session, like one for Gamma, one for main project, or if we just do one combined. I kind of feel like it might be better to do combined since we're probably all going to go to both of them anyway. But yeah, so I just wanted to mention that and say, hey, we should coordinate on that and get a submission in before the 30th of September when it closes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for actually getting that on the agenda. I think the specific option, the CFP, you have to like go through a few things to see what's even possible. But the thing that seems most relevant to us is a sub project face-to-face session. That collaborative session. There's like two different things are basically the same thing. Basically, we have the option to have an hour-ish of time to work together, talk about anything we want about Gateway API in person at the Contributor Summit. Out of curiosity, maybe if people can temporarily raise their hands here, how many people think they'll be able to make it to Contributor Summit this year in Detroit? Like a few. Cool. Okay. It looks like there will be at least 7 of us. Great. That is great to see. And if more can make it, that's even better. But it looks like we'll have a good group there. All right. Next on the list. Well, actually, before I go any further, I think the question was if we want 1 or 2, and I'm fine with just a single collaborative session for everyone. Is that good? Great. Okay, cool. Next up, I think Candace, you're up next. I can't hear you, but it could just be my audio. I'm not sure.
Barely. I heard just really lightly for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
That's better.
Okay, just like a couple of millimeters difference in my where my mic is. So I noticed that Nick had submitted a GEP 1282, which is the backend properties GEP, and we were talking about the why we wanted the backend properties to be a little bit better specified. And it's tied in with re-encrypt or, the TLS on the back end, which is something that that we are very interested in making sure happens in 060. And I was hoping that the community as a whole was more interested in making sure it happens in 060. To have re-encrypt available. So when I created the discussion on it, this GEP came up, and now this GEP is done. So I just was kind of, sort of exploring what is it, do you need somebody to flesh out the technology in this? Or do you want to have someone who's more a maintainer be involved with that, of which I am not. Do you need feedback on ideas or any other information or help to get this going?
I think it's the next step is to actually to decide on like what we want to do and write and build out some structs and some sample code and stuff like that, and fill out the what, like the how, basically. I think my preferred option was some sort of back-end service kind of resource that has a bunch of, or service back-end resource that has a bunch of information about the resource, all the stuff that we talked about, including the TLS stuff. I like the idea of calling it a backend, because that's like when we talked sort of offline about this, you made the good point that we don't want to block this on the Gamma stuff, but I feel like we want to make sure that it's compatible, that terminology wise at least, and that's what in the Gamma discussions we've been talking about how a Kubernetes service serves two purposes: the front end and the back end. The back end is like the collection of endpoints and associated properties. The front end is the naming and the identity. So I think that some sort of backend service resource would be really good. It needs to just have some spots to put. It needs to have like a spot to put a reference to probably a service as a backend, as a collection of endpoints. And then some spots to put the other config. But that's pretty much all I really thought. So the next steps are for somebody to do that. It doesn't need to be a maintainer that does that though. I'm happy for you or anyone to pick that up and do that. Rob?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. We're very much so far have been focused on MVPs for things, including gaps here, where this is a gap with goals, non-goals, but not actually the implementation details. And so as you're saying, the next step would be to actually fill out implementation details. I'm wondering how small of a resource we're open to starting with. I don't have an answer to this, but it sounds like the real interest here is TLS re-encrypt, but we want to contain that in a resource that can handle more kinds of configuration. Do we want to wait until we have multiple bits of configuration in this kind of resource before we introduce it to the API, or is it acceptable to introduce this one bit of configuration at first? Any preference?
Yeah, I've got a use case for this with OSM where we support pluggable ingress, and the OSM control plane creates a certificate that for all, an Envoy parlance upstream, but I get for all cluster traffic that the ingress controller brings in. And so this is, as we try to adopt Gateway API, something for TLS would be super useful, even if that's all this resource does. So there's comments in the chat about experimental being good, being a good place for this, and I'd agree. I'd love to see a resource get in, just so I can, we can have something to be able to accomplish that goal.
Yeah, so I agree that I think experimental is the right place for it. It is literally experimental at that point. But like, whatever we do, we have to do something to handle the case of your gateway is implemented using a proxy and you need to have the TLS details to connect to the backend service, right? Like and so having another resource that does that, and then that resource is also a place for other things about that service, would be very useful, right? The other thing that the other two things that I thought of when I was writing this are load balancing backend for endpoint, load balancing algorithm for endpoints, as opposed to load balancing backend for routes. We have a spot to put the load balancing backend for routes, but not a spot to put the load balancing algorithm for choosing amongst endpoints once you have a route chosen. That is probably the spot where you will want to put like sticky sessions and stuff like that. And the yeah, so like I think then we can look at expanding out. But I think there's absolutely other properties that will fit into that bucket. And so that's why I'm okay with doing it just with TLS to start with, and then we add other properties as we go. This is what in my mind, what we're trying to do here is to create a space in the API for that information to live. And that currently there is nowhere. We create a resource, we put it in there. Ideally, we're like, oh, this is really good. It's really good to have this stuff available. And then we kick off the process to the long and extremely involved process once we have once we have some clear clarity on what we actually want to store there, to say, hey, we should put those into the service object. But like, I feel like there's no point trying to do the KEP process until we have something that says a pretty good idea about the stuff we want to put in there, so that we're not having to do multiple rounds of service changes.
That makes sense to me. I think that's a reasonable starting point. Just to recap, I think what we're saying is we're okay with taking this GEP as it sits today and providing, the next step is to provide a proposal for implementation details of a new resource that is generic enough a name that it can support more than TLS re-encrypt, but that all the initial scope of it will be TLS re-encrypt for configuration for a service. And I think, Candace, you may be volunteering to take that next step.
Okay. And it's
Yeah,
the
I mean-
implement.
So the implementation step, I guess what I was trying to say is I'm 100% fine if you want to do it, but I don't want to army volunteer you to do it as well. So
Yeah, to be clear, I wasn't trying to volunteer you, but if you're interested, very, very open to contributions.
And so one thing I didn't understand when what you were talking about is we had talked about this non-goal of not requiring changes to Kubernetes services, but then you just were talking about.
So they're not requiring changes to Kubernetes services, just about the amount of time it takes to make a change to Kubernetes service, not about the fact that it's 100% undesirable to at some point in the future make changes to Kubernetes service. The non-goal is like a non-goal for now, because making a change to Kubernetes service takes at least a year, probably longer, because we'll need to like make a KEP, figure out the KEP, get the KEP accepted, make the KEP implementable, and then grind through the process of adding feature flags to add the new fields and so on and so forth. Rob can tell you all about how much effort and how much time that takes. And so I think that it would be really nice. I suspect that at the end of the day, between this and Gamma, there will be changes that we need to make to the service resource at some point, but we're going to have to prototype those changes in some other resource first. And so so that also affects some of the conversations we'll be having in the extremely long thread about the Gamma stuff. But so I would say let's make the new resource, and then there's a future goal down the track of bringing it into service.
Okay.
Cool. Is there anything else to talk about on this front? Candace, do you have enough information if you want to proceed with this, or is anyone?
I think that let me take a look into it, and I know how to reach everybody individually if I should have questions about it. Yeah, it might take me longer than it would take someone else, but
That is fine.
it looks like okay.
Yeah, completely fine. John, I see a question from you, or a hand.
Yeah, I was going to mention we've talked a lot about service properties here. Just from my perspective, these properties aren't something that's a property of just the service. It's much more specific than that. I think we'll need to allow, at the very least, port specific policies. Like, for example, you probably don't want to encrypt port 80, but you probably do want to encrypt port 443, right? But even beyond that, we may even need source aware backend property selection. So for example, I may have a route that matches on the gRPC service and I don't know, HTTP readiness service, right? For one of those, I need to use HTTP2. For the other one, I may need to not use HTTP2. So I don't know that service is the right level of, applying these things. And we don't necessarily need to go into too deep here if we're trying to be high level, but that's something I would love to see considered when designing this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Nick very intentionally used backend in the GEP name. And then I think when I was describing it, I used service, but I think backend is very intentionally not service in this context. Specifically calling out port and then source aware would be good. I don't know if that's covered in the gap.
It is not currently covered, but it is a good point.
And thank you to whoever's taking notes. That's great.
I think, yeah, I'm taking notes. I think I've got it.
Great, thanks. I think Bowie, you were about to say something.
Oh, I was just going to comment that it's funny that Kubernetes kind of merged service together with different ports because of naming reasons, like in terms of DNS. But they are technically two different services if you're running HTTP and HTTPS. Unfortunately, we just have to carry that forward in our whatever we design, because that's kind of the choice Kubernetes.
Yeah.
I would say chuck that on the pile of things about service that we just have to live with.
Yep. Cool. Okay, I'll move on to the next one then. And I think Shane, this means you're up, and that's milestones and organization. If you're still around.
I was talking into my muted headset. This is definitely up for debate, but if you want it to, but I assume most people would just be okay with this. So just put up a hand if you want to talk about it. Just wanted to let people know that the idea right now that some of the us maintainers have been discussing is to try and get things into milestones and start getting on like a milestone and project-based workflow where you can actually kind of see the intended progression of things. We're starting there already. We have a V060 and we've moved some things into there, but just wanted to kind of let people know that the intention will be to kind of do that more and start getting to the point where in the future, you know, we are doing kind of wholesale planning of how we actually lay out our releases, and hopefully by proxy, doing quicker, smaller potentially releases. We'll see. But yeah, just you'll probably see me moving a bunch of stuff, and it then perhaps Nick and Rob will be asynchronously moving them back. We'll find out. But that's kind of the idea right now.
Yeah, and actually, this is tangential to that, but there's also an 051 milestone out that I kind of messed that up a little bit because I added things to bugs to an 051 milestone, and then the PR that fixed them got in, but they didn't get cherry picked back in. I'm creating another issue that will track cherry picks that we want for 05 or 051 in this case. And I'm really hoping we can get a release out soon. There's been some really good bug fixes that have gotten in. I'd rather just get them out instead of waiting for 060. So there is that other milestone just sitting there. Yeah, just trying to make more sense of milestones going forward. And if you see things that you feel like belong in 060 or 051, ping any maintainer, just post it on Slack and we'll notice. But we want to make milestones meaningful and help them prioritize our work.
Roger that.
Cool.
So
And
yeah,
I
the
think
next one then. The next
No,
one
go
then,
ahead.
we discussed this in Gamma twice, I think, and I just wanted to throw it out to this creator. I think I was asked, like there was a suggestion from the group to kind of bring it back to this group and kind of suggest, you know, when you have something that's experimental, you have something that is maybe in the middle of a GEP, but you want to be able to do some like prototyping, some proof of concept and stuff like that. What would we say? I guess, what are the opinions on what is the way you could do that in Gateway API today? Or best way, maybe.
This is a good question.Maybe, and to understand it more, are we talking about, you know, basically adding provisional features? You know, you have an existing mesh implementation, let's say, and you want to just test out proof of concept, a potentially new gateway API feature to see if it even makes sense? Or are you talking about a built from scratch implementation to POC some feature?
Yeah. Kind of the second one. So the basic idea was, well, I guess historically experimental, and not that it's been around that long, but the idea with experimental right now would appear to be that even though it's experimental, it requires kind of consensus built on a CAP and everybody's kind of behind it. Can there be a place where somebody can, I mean, other than creating a separate repo, which is the obvious backup, right? Is there a place where if you're working on a get, but it's still in the PR process and you want to show like some proof of concept and some like Go code maybe, or something like that, a place to put that kind of stuff? Should we have that? Can we have that? I think the obvious implication is to make it very easy if somebody during the gamma processes wants to kind of like kick up some proof of concepts for like setting up, for instance, I don't know, just having like a mesh POC that has like the actual mesh API type, but you don't want to commit that into the API itself, even if it's experimental, right? Does that make sense?
Nick, you're about to say something.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, like, it feels to me like the only reason that we would need to have like a blessed shared way of doing that is if we want people to be able to do that and collaborate on it. Otherwise, like a fork of the repo is fine, right? Like, because, and if you're doing a POC to be like, this is what I think we should do, then you're pointing people like to a branch on your own fork or something like that is fine. You're like, in fact, I would argue that would be the right way to do it, is to create a WIP PR and have the WIP PR sort of have all the details in it, and then you say, if you want to try this out, you pull the WIP PR and you pull the WIP branch and and compile it yourself. Like, I guess I think that most of the stuff that we have done to this point has sort of worked like that, and it feels like having anything more than that, like we really need to be really careful that we're not running that we're not accidentally blessing things as the way when then not yet. And that's why I think we have the sort of the rough thing that you've mentioned there about experimental requiring some consensus. Experimental is currently about hey, the community has agreed on this, but we haven't got it conformance tested and implemented enough yet to be confident that it's the way that we want to keep the API. It is the equivalent of API server feature flag. You can flip it to true rather than.
So I have a question. Is the ask mostly around just like, hey, do we have some resource, for example, some GitHub repo, or more than that? Because you can always just create a GitHub repo and share it with people.
Yeah, I must be honest. I think I lost a little bit of the momentum or context of this when I put it on here, and then just kind of like it sat here for a week. Because what Nick's saying seems to make like perfect sense, and it's making me like question why I even put this on here. But at the same time, I think if I'm remembering correctly, part of the desire was to have like a shared place to kind of put stuff that would not be implemented by like the average implementation there, so that it could be collaborated upon easier. But that doesn't mean, at the end of the day, it might be a solution searching for a problem in retrospect. So I don't know, Keith, I hate to call on you on this one, but just like, I think my intention was to try and provide like a very easy way for you and everyone else doing Gamma to like just put stuff in that could then actually be potentially used a little bit, but not actually end up in the API, right? Not actually end up published. Is it too much? Does it matter?
Yeah, I think that with Gamma, one of the things that we're running into is, we're at such an early stage, and we're trying to continue to maintain forward momentum while we don't really know what the exact it's kind of like a choose your own adventure book. And there are different kind of dependent streams of potential work we want to investigate, and we're trying to figure out the best way to go about doing that. I honestly, the fork idea, the fork process sounds perfectly reasonable to me. If what we need is if you believe in this approach, then start a fork of Gateway API, get some code in there, and maybe play with your implementation. Maybe demo it possibly. Somebody else, if they like that approach as well, they could demo it with their implementation and kind of just see how that works. There could be comments in the PR. This works, this doesn't work. We could pull out to discussions. I feel like that would be that's pretty much fine. What you just need is champions and communication, and work could happen on that fork. So that sounds good enough for now until something breaks with that.
Yeah. Okay. And I think now that you've like talked, and I just remember the conversation that we had before, I think the main question here, and I just didn't word it well, and I messed up with like reading my own wording, was do we think that it's okay to put truly experimental things in experimental or not? And that's actually, I think, an open question. I mean, I think we kind of assumed that you actually have to have some consensus built if you put something in experimental, but can you literally put something that's like purely experimental in there and expect it to potentially be merged? Because later but also know that it may be ripped out, you know?
Can you define purely experimental a bit more?
Like something that does not have consensus, I think would be the short version. So like, would it be okay for somebody to put a mesh API type into experimental? I think is what we were actually getting at that last meeting. Now that I'm kind of like recalling what we were talking about, would that be okay to put it in there for a while, to let it sink in, to let it simmer, to let people actually potentially build a little bit of an implementation of it just to mess with it? But the intention may be outweighing the need is the only other thing. I don't want to spend too much time on this if the need doesn't feel very great.
I feel like there's nothing that you get with that that you don't get with, you know, somebody saying, hey, I have done an implementation on this branch in my fork. And
That's fair.
merging things into main on the main and gateway API repo does carry an implementer of this is part of the spec. Because that main on the repo is the spec, regardless of whether or not it's, you know, technically we've said in the experiment in the versioning that that the spec is like released in a release bundle, but like, you know, if we had any of these resources in a release bundle, like there's kind of some expectation that they'll stick around for at least a little bit, and then we'll need to do deprecation things and stuff like that. In my mind. Like that's, if I was as a consumer, that's what I would expect.
So experimental ends up actually being more like alpha.
That's
the way we've done it.
I largely consider it very close to alpha. If you look at upstream Kubernetes, there are alpha feature gates. I consider experimental fields very similar to that. In that you needed to go through the KEP process, you needed to get consensus that this made sense. You needed to have, you know, go through the full review, go through, you know, the thing I'm worried about here is if we make experimental too experimental, we're going to lose users. And we really need experimental people to be testing in the experimental channel if we ever want something to graduate from experimental to standard. And so experimental needs to be at least somewhat stable. I know we can remove things, but we need to have some level of stability there that somebody can say, hey, I'm going to use this and test it out and see how it works. So I view this as being very similar to an alpha feature gate on upstream Kubernetes. The experimental name denotes a lot of instability, and I'd say we're aiming for a bit less than that, at least me personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I go back to, you know, thinking about continuous deployment and continuous delivery, you know, main is what's in production. And so if you take that principle towards like API versioning, like we're doing with Gateway API, I agree with what's been said in the sense that main carries some, you know, definitely has some semantic meaning there.
Yeah, but what's been said, I think, is good. I personally feel perfectly satisfied with just having talked about it, and it's as simple as it might have. You know, it's a simple answer. So, unless anybody really wants to dig into that further, I'm okay with let's consider experimental not actually experimental in maybe the linguistic sense, and move on. And then the last one I had, I actually don't think I have an action item for this, but I did want to mention there has been interest. In the Gamma meeting in particular, there's been some feedback that from at least 2 people, including, well, I
Did Shane cut out for anyone
guess
else?
you may not know them. So just earlier, did I cut out?
Yes, you did.
But you came right back in as I started speaking, so never mind.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think I'm just going to continue to track this, but there are people that are saying that they would want to show up for the Gateway meeting. Were there an earlier one? I think I'm going to talk about this one more time at Gamma, but I found at least a couple people who aren't coming to any of the meetings, who are European time zones, Poland and so forth, that would like to come, but it's prohibitive. And then the Gamma meeting has at least a couple of people that are attending that one and would most likely attend this one, they said, if there was at least a one earlier, less prohibitive time. So just kind of a heads up that that's still a thing, and there are still people I think that we might gain by doing that. I'm going to continue to follow up on that thread unless anybody today really wants to push for a specific action item.
Yeah, that makes sense. I missed the last Gamma meeting. I'm curious, for Gamma meeting attendance, has it been pretty even between time zones, or has there been one that's gotten more attendance than the other?
That's one of the things that I actually need to go back and double check. But if I recall, we've had at least a couple of weeks where the earlier one actually did better than the later one.
Good to know.
So that's it for me. Sorry for hogging up so much time.
No, great points. Yeah, I encourage people to keep on following up with meeting times. I wish everyone was in the same time zone and we could all just make it to the same meeting globally. But hopefully we can find some times that work well for as many people as possible. I know at any time we switch to a different time zone, we're going to lose some people, but hopefully if we choose to do that, we will gain more. But yeah,
The obvious
it's
answer
really
is
tough.
time travel over IP, Rob.
Figured it out.
Or is it the other way around? It's the other way around, right?
Yeah. Cool. All right. I think we're into triage then. Nick, I think you're up first. Generics. I missed this one.
Yeah, so this PR has a generics implementation for in the conformance helpers. Looking at it, it looks fine to me mostly, but it's more it would more just sort of raise the point for me that we don't have any other generics code in there at the moment, and so we should write down what we're going to do about generics somewhere.
I think Kubernetes Upstream has a policy and has started to allow it, but I agree, we need a policy. We did let something slip in. It was one of the slice utils, I think, is used somewhere. So it's not completely unprecedented, but I think this was, if I remember this one, I think this one had a bit more, yeah, a bit more clear use of it. Anyways, yeah, does anyone feel comfortable volunteering for this? I agree that we need to document this somewhere. Does anyone want to just kind of maybe copy a reference from what the policy is in Upstream?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly acceptable. I think we just need to do that. If we don't have any takers today, we need to log an issue, have a block VO60 just like everything else, and yeah, make sure someone does it.
Sounds like a potentially good first issue for somebody, especially if it exists in Upstream Kubernetes.
Any volunteers to create that issue? And I agree, it would be a good first issue.
I can do it. If nobody else does, I can take it.
Awesome, thanks, Keith. All right. Next up, yeah, this is going to be a good conversation.
Yes.
Nick, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm happy to, it looks like heaps of other people commented on it, but I haven't had a chance to look at yet. So I'm probably happy to leave this one until next week if we want, because there's a lot to talk about. If people want me to sort of talk about the general strategy I've gone with here, a little bit here, but I kind of want to be careful to time box this one because this one could drag out, I think. So do people want me to talk a little bit about like the overall strategy I was doing here, or should we just move on, leave this for ASIC?
Let me look at what else we have. Timeline, Damian had a couple. Maybe a 5-minute overview of this one. I know that can't cover much, but.
Yeah, I mean, so if you could just pull up the top of the file, I think I tried to summarize it pretty well in the thing. But so basically, status is really inconsistent across all the different resources. This is an attempt to make the status consistent. I specifically did some stuff that I knew, like basically after I started looking at this for a while, I was like, we're going to have to make some breaking changes or some changes to status that will break conformance because we use the status in conformance. So I was like, well, if we're going to break conformance, we should break it all, break it once, break it properly, and fix it up so that so that we only have to do this once. So that's why some of the proposals here are pretty big changes, because I'm like, well, I'm going to design the dream and then we'll figure out if we can make the dream work rather than trying to design trying to take what we have and like incrementally change it. I'm going to be like, this is my wish list for how I would like status to look. So if you scroll down, there's a bunch of stuff about prior art and stuff like that that is important for people to understand. But if you keep going, there's a list of specific, the list of the main changes. This one here. So yeah, currently we've got a mix of like 4. I think that the broad strokes thing is I want to have a condition that says this resource has been proposed and accepted for processing and has successfully become part of a system of gateway API resources. That I have proposed to call attached because in general, every gateway API resource attaches to another one except for gateway class because it's the top of the tree. Gateway API resources are a tree. And so, that's the first thing I'm proposing is that we take all of the resources that mean this is accepted for processing. Some of them are accepted. Listeners have, detached, which is even worse because it's the opposite polarity to everything else. And so to just make them all say attached. And that way, when we're talking about when things have been accepted for processing, we say the resources are attached. That's the way that we talk about it. Secondly, we should move to all our conditions being positive polarity. Good state equals good state true, not bad state false. Prevents double negatives when you're reading them, makes it a bit easier to read. The reasons for having the negative polarity ones are to be able to have a small number of positive polarity summary conditions like ready on pod or node. And then if you think about the node resource, it has a ready condition that, if anything is wrong, flips to false. But then there are a bunch of specific error conditions like memory pressure, disk pressure, network is down, that if that specific thing goes wrong, they flip to true. But in the happy case, network is down, false. Disk pressure, false. Memory pressure, false. And so I think that the argument was made to me a couple of times that, hey, being able to having things say some error false is harder to understand than like everything is good true. And so that's but and again, it doesn't really matter what we pick. We could opt to have a mixed set of conditions, like some are positive, some are negative, but having all of one means that it's much easier for machine consumption of the conditions. The last change that's a bit big is that all relevant conditions for a resource must be added at the first time it's observed. So HTTP routes must always have accepted, ready if we have it, and resolved refs, regardless of their state. So if you don't know if the resolved refs are done yet, then it's unknown. If you don't know if it's accepted, it's unknown. Otherwise, accepted must always be present and either true, false, or unknown. And so that would mean that we need to change the conformance test to test that those conditions were always present and some known state. The reason there is that it means that it's really easy to accidentally use conditions as like it's only present when it's one of the states. And that means that then you have to have a complicated logic about when you're consuming them, you have to have complicated logic about if it's not present, then what does it mean? What does that mean? Does that mean that it's good or bad? And strictly by the API conventions, not present means I don't know. But that is much better represented by having it be present and having it be unknown, because then it's clear and explicit. So yeah, there, in terms of the changes, Candace asked in the chat how many changes the implementers will need to make. It's not a huge number of changes. Like most of the changes are changing the name of the condition or changing when you set the condition. Changing when you set the condition is probably the biggest set of changes that you'll always need to set. You touch the condition, you set the condition. That's probably the biggest change. I'm not 100% wedded to all of these. Again, the idea here was to drop something that has, that's like my wish list and be prepared to negotiate down, which I am. So, but I think that if we can do all of these things, it'll really set us up well for having a very clear set of rules for status as we make more resources, which we will be guaranteed. And also we can give people clear status guidance for when they create their own resources like policy and reference grant. So right now, reference grant has no status. So that means that if you create a reference grant, there's no way to know if it's doing anything. And the same for policy resources. There needs to be at least an accepted or attached condition on them to say, this is, this resource is syntactically and semantically valid. Okay, I've talked enough.
Yeah, this is great. I do want to honor the time box here. Thank you for the intro and thanks for the great write-up. Just one question. As far as timeline, what release are you hoping to get this into?
I mean, ideally we get it in 060. I know that's a big ask, but the later we leave these breaking changes, the more painful it's going to be. The more implementers are going to have implemented what already exists to do the conformance, the more implementer pain we are going to cause by breaking. And I don't think we can get away from the fact that we will have to break this status at some point, to some extent.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would really like to get this into 060. Of course, that gives us basically a month. It's not a lot of time. And yeah, so with that, are there things that we can help with? Anyone in the community that can help push this along? So
I think step one is I need everybody to have a read of this and argue with me about it. Please keep the please keep the things there. I think Candace has asked in the chat, can we split it out to recommendations for 060 and then changes in a later patch? I don't think so, because we can't. Some of these are breaking changes and there's no way to make it nicer. The more that we spread it out, the worse it's going to be. When we make this change, we need to do it all at once, I think. And because you can't have, maybe we might be able to keep the old conditions around for a little while, and that might help a bit, but then it'll be like, it's when we update the conformance tests that everyone will have to do things to stay conformant. So we can add the new conditions in as recommended things that aren't tested in the conformance, but that means that then the conformance break, we just push the conformance break one version in the future. But It's when do you break the conformance? Well, you got to do it sometime.
yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, well, there's a lot to go through on this. I know we've already gotten some good comments, but this is PR 1383. Highly recommend you take some time to review it in the next few days, because we are trying to move at a pretty quick timeline here. Looks like Keith, you've got a hand.
Is basically the goal we're trying to have 060 out by, I know it's at KubeCon, is that getting KubeCon the 24th? Is that a safe assumption as far as timeline?
Yeah, but our releases take a while because not only do we have to approve releases, we have to get SIG Network API reviewers to approve them. That takes a period of time. Usually there's some feedback in there. So we'll see. But realistically, we need to have everything ready no later than a month from now.
Yeah, so the timelines are tight. I think one of the biggest changes that will need to be reviewed by the API reviewers is moving reference grant to beta, which I think is non-negotiable for SIG. So we've got to do that because reference grant is required to have the API be correct.
Yep, agreed. Cool. Okay, so yeah, if you have ideas, opinions, whatever, that's the PR to review. Appreciate any feedback there. That's very related, Nick. Your next one on 060 timeline.
Yeah, basically that's the point that I was trying to make. I'm pretty worried that we've got a lot of issues still in the 060 milestone, and some of them are really big ones. I am planning on spending like half my time for until KubeCon on making sure this happens. But this is not a one-man lift. Like, you gotta, we all gotta pitch in a bit here. So please, I just wanted to say, hey, we all need to focus a bit on like trying to pick up some things and get them done. There is a bunch of small good first issues style issues in there that are like, we just need documentation updates. There'll probably be some more after today's meeting. Please feel free, if you are watching this recorded, if there are good first issues left in the milestone, those are your first go-to. Please find them and push your hand up to do them. Because we desperately need to get this release out, and there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, completely agree. Thanks for calling that out. Maybe at the start of the next meeting, we can spend some time walking through the milestone and making sure that all the issues are assigned. And if you want to get ahead of that and assign yourself to an issue in the milestone, that's even better. Danian, I think you've got a couple issues here. Compatible listeners across gateways. Maybe you can give a bit of, you're here.
Yeah, trying to decipher the spec for collapsing compatible listeners across gateways. The spec does provide support for that, and I try to capture those details here. And what I interpret from that is as you see here, is that for each listener, protocol must be the same. So HTTP, for example, but host names must be unique. And the spec goes on to provide a little more detail there. But when I look at the conformance tests, they are not consistent with that. So if you click on conformance tests there, you're going to see three gateways that all have the same protocol and all essentially have the same host name, since it's unspecified, I believe by default, it's all host names, right?
That's
Right.
Yeah, okay. I see the confusion here. I think how this was intended to read in the spec was that you may choose to merge gateways if listeners across gateways, if they are clearly different. And in the case of the conformance tests, you referenced here, I don't think these could be merged. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying here is these are basically the same thing. They're both listening. They're listening at 80 HTTP, same protocol, and there's no restriction for host name. So I don't think.
It's why the issue I kind of call out, either I feel like the spec either needs to be updated or something needs to be done with the conformance test, because right, we see that the spec allows the collapsing of listeners across gateways, but this particular setup for conformance tests does not support that, right? And so I don't know if we add a new flag that points to a different set of manifests that allow the collapsing, because this doesn't allow that.
So
I think. Go ahead.
Does it
Dave.
really not though? Like if you think about this, like I think the things are here is that you either need to consider allowed routes part of the thing that makes the listeners distinct, or you don't. And if you don't, then it means that like the part where you're generating, like figuring out what listeners attached to the gateway is kind of separate to generating the underlying config. So the way I kind of anticipated this working is that you would go through, build the whole tree of gateway API resources, figure out what routes are there, and then you may need to like look at the set of routes that are associated with the gateway to determine if the listeners are distinct. That's one of the reasons that it's underspecified, is that like I wanted to leave space there for it to be possible, but no one had done it yet, so we didn't really know what it would look like. So I'm sorry that you are the beta test.
Yeah, I mean, no worries. It's just, I looked at this, right, and we're basically saying that this configuration of 3 gateways that all have the same port and the same host name are incompatible. So so there's no way for, you know, the Envoy gateway, the project that I'm trying to get conformant here, to run these conformance tests, because these 3 gateways from a multi-gateway listener collapsing standpoint, they're not compatible. So Envoy gateway is not going to be able to collapse these 3 gateway listeners.
I think, yeah, that makes sense. I think when I looked at this, I thought of this as kind of a implementation detail, a kind of optimization of, you know, you can choose if these are unique to collapse these to a single gateway, but it's not a guarantee that our conformance tests will necessarily have completely unique gateway listeners. So I guess, and maybe this is maybe not everyone has the same view, but my thought was this was just a potential optimization an implementation could choose to do, but not something that could be relied on for every conformance test.
But if the spec says that you may be able to do this, but there's no way to have an implementation run conformant, you're right. It's a difficult situation for implementers, because I, like myself, read this and say, okay, well, May seems like we can do this, and for right reasons, right? Is we want to try to optimize the infrastructure instead of creating an individual Envoy proxy for each gateway. It's like, okay, well, if we have distinct listeners, right? If we're following the spec here, then we should be able to collapse these listeners across gateways. But by doing that, there's no way we can run the conformance tests. And so if we want to keep the spec as is, which I'm fine, having some type of flexibility in the conformance tests, that maybe you supply the conformance test a flag that says, you know, collapse gateway listeners version or something like that, right? Some kind of flag that would then run, you know, a separate base manifest that doesn't have these incompatible gateways.
A few hands here. I think Travis here first. We can't hear you if you're talking.
Yes, I tried to press the record button instead of the mic button, which didn't work very well. So I think this came up in another discussion I had with someone else, where like apparently the prescribed means of handling a conformance test that tests something that's optional, but that you do not implement, is basically just you don't run that conformance test, which is, I guess it'll work, but it's kind of very limited. So I think the prior point is like, we do need probably something that, you know, lays out more clearly which conformance tests you actually opt into for these sets that are you're not necessarily expected to implement.
Well, and the challenge here is this issue is at the very foundation of the conformance test, right? So, right, I mean, it creates these 3 gateways, and they are not compatible if the implementation is doing a multi-gateway listener collapsing approach.
Yes,
I feel like we're looking at it from the wrong way, though. Like, we're saying that we want to skip the conformance test, but really, this is the bread and butter of gateway. And if your implementation can't support it, then the implementation needs to be fixed, and you should not try to collapse these.
Well, sorry, we all have our hands at the same time. I would like to understand where the conformance test breaks down, because the result of collapsing, I think, is that you end up having like the same address or some shared resource where these two things are co-located that you can find. Like, I would be interested to see, is there a way we can write a conformance test that looks at the status and like kind of grab the right IPs to send the request to? Like, what is the piece that breaks? Like, I would be,
well, for my implementation, it breaks at creating the gateways, right? So the controller, if everyone can go on mute, I'm getting a ton of background or feedback, excuse me.
Somebody's got crazy feedback.
Yeah. But anyways, I mean, it breaks at the gateway creation stage, right? So the controller is reconciling these gateways and saying, wait a second, all three of these are invalid because they conflict with each other.
It feels to me like the problem here comes down to the fact that the way that we have left what constitutes a conflicting listener too vague. So the problem here is that the as you've read the spec to say that that a non-conflicting listener has a separate can't have the same host name across just the listener resources. It needs to be distinct across port, protocol, and host name. I think it seems reasonable to me, like looking at the conformance tests conceptually, it seems like you should be able to like collapse those, because the thing that is different about them is actually like which routes can attach, not any other thing of properties about the gateway, right? Like if you think about it in terms of like if you look at all three of those things together, and if you tried to create the thing that you can't do is put all three of those listeners into a single. Currently, you can't put them into a single gateway as listeners, right? That's the thing that, in my mind, the thing that always made the idea of having collapsible listeners is that you can basically take all the listeners from all the gateways that you've got and put them into a single gateway, right? Like, and have the listeners still make sense because they are different. And so if you look at the listeners that are in those three different gateways, if you gave them names, then you could put them into the same gateway as listeners, and they would be distinct enough because you can the routes can then refer to the name of the listener. And it's all about just those three gateways are used solely to distinguish between like what routes can attach to them, not like what settings or host names or something like that are there. So it's more like it comes down to like, are the routes distinct rather than are the listeners distinct?
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation, but I know some people have to drop here, so I want to be conscious of that. This is a good issue to follow up on. I think we all have comments, and there's lots of discussion to follow up here. So 1385, please come back to this one. And maybe if we can take any follow-up comments and put it on this issue, I think it will be helpful for anyone coming back to this in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Cool. All right, thanks so much, everyone. We'll move the rest to the agenda for next time, and talk to you next week. Yeah.